thing too, specifically to a couple of secular Muslims' points. We were talking earlier about Adam and Eve and how can we track our genetics back to Adam and Eve. Well, our autosomal nuclear DNA, that's where we find roughly 100 new mutations per person per generation. But we also have what's called uniparentally inherited DNA compartments. That's the Y chromosome, which is nuclear DNA, but it is only passed down from one side, the father's side. You got your Y chromosome from your dad. Then we also have mitochondrial DNA. That's its own little DNA compartment outside of the nucleus. And that mutation rate is about 0.5 per generation. The Y chromosome is about somewhere between 1 and 3. Either way, it's really fast. Okay, it's a lot fast. So for example, here in a recent paper in 2022, notice how it talks about the pedigree rates. That's the observed mutation rate. Jackson Rowe earlier was talking about a molecular clock. That's the observed mutation rate. You can basically take, grandmothers, mothers, and daughters, count out the amount of differences in the mitochondrial DNA and come up with a mutation rate. And so they point out it's about 10 times higher than what's called a phylogenetic rate. That's the evolutionary mutation rate. Anyways, the point I wanted to make is these are two phylogenetic trees. Okay, this is a mitochondrial phylogenetic tree, and this is a Y chromosome phylogenetic tree. So this is worldwide DNA variation. I want to focus specifically on the mitochondrial DNA. So this is worldwide female diversity, basically, since the mitochondrial DNA is passed on the mother's side. Well, we've actually got Eve's sequence. So here there's people groups, okay, HVR haplogroup, most common in Europe, and we know how much variation separates any two people. So let's say me and Sam, me and Jackson Rowe, your average is about somewhere between 20 and 25 DNA differences separating any two people. That's nothing. That's trivial. And in light of a fast mutation rate, it only takes a couple hundred generations to generate that kind of variety. Okay. And so we've actually got the Eve consensus sequence. We know what her mitochondrial genome was. And there's far too little variation in light of the fast mutation rate for deep time evolution to be true. And so in a nutshell, my point is this. Yes, using genetics, we've tracked back to Eve, who would have had a perfect genome, because we're tracking back to where there's none of those differences separating any two people. Okay, so firstly, tell me if that makes sense, and what are your thoughts on that?
Who are you asking?
Oh, secular Muslims specifically, but if this is new to him, anybody can respond.
Yeah, this is new. I just don't know how exactly you are tracing back. This seems to be a model. It seems to be just an application of a theory. I just don't see how you're tracing it. Like, there's no evidence of Adam and Eve, so how can you even know that?
Yes, it's right here.
It would be extinct.
Are you familiar with mitochondrial Eve and Y
No.
chromosome Adam? Literally all female mitochondrial DNA goes back to a single mitochondrial DNA ancestor. Now, you want to put that ancestor somewhere between 100 and 200,000 years ago in Africa. But the genetic variation doesn't allow for that, because this is not something creationists made up, secular Muslim. You can get this DNA variation from the 1,000 Genomes Project, and you can reflect it using a tree building program in an unrooted phylogenetic tree. And so you can see explosive growth from a center point. We know the mutation rate is fast, and we know there's only a few DNA differences separating any two people. And so my question for you, how do you put mitochondrial Eve back 200,000 years ago if on average we're only separated by 20 to 25 DNA differences? Remember, the mutation rate is somewhere between 0.1 and 0.5 per generation. That's fast. That means it only takes a couple hundred generations to produce this amount of DNA variety. Go ahead, secular Muslim.
No, I'm just gonna have to look into it more when I gonna just have to compare the evidence.
Well, and notice this: if you're familiar with the biblical story of the repopulation of the planet, basically in terms of humans after the flood, you've got Noah, his wife, their 3 sons, right? Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and their 3 wives. Well, what did you learn tonight? You learned that mitochondrial DNA is passed down on the mother's side. Notice what's called haplogroups. These are the 3 major haplogroups, L, M, and N. Well, when we start from the Bible, we understand that all people today descended from those 3 reproducing couples, Shem, Ham, Japheth, and their 3 wives. But what do we find on a mitochondrial DNA phylogenetic tree? Notice 3 major haplogroups corresponding to Noah's 3 daughters-in-law, and explosive growth from those center points. Now, to you, you'd have to say that's a coincidence. But to us as creationists, we would say this fits perfectly. After the flood, about 4,500 years ago, you have all people descending from those 3 original reproducing couples. And lo and behold, we got 3 major haplogroups, short lines separating those groups, long lines radiating out, suggesting post-flood history. What are your thoughts on that? Speak to that a little bit.
You're still on mute, bud.
He might be.
I was saying no.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry.
Go to take your time. Go ahead. You're on mute.
No, no. I've heard the opposite from secular sources. So
Which
you guys
sources?
are just citing different sources.
Yeah,
this is just a mitochondrial DNA tree based on worldwide mitochondrial DNA variation. And so your sources are going to be based on interpretations and inferences using a phylogenetic mutation rate. But this is just right in your face. This is just the manifestation of DNA variation, and it falls into a tree that allows for 3 major haplogroups. We all come from Noah's 3 daughters-in-law. I mean, you said that you came out of biblical creation. You're now a secularist. You believe in evolution, but you haven't seen this data presented before. So it makes me wonder if you made an informed choice to reject biblical creation, because this is some of our most powerful evidence and you don't seem familiar with it. Speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, I did. I remember Ken Ham's debate with Bill Nye. I have gone to the Creation Museum. I have heard the scientific evidence from Answers in Genesis. I was mostly influenced by Answers in Genesis, but I just started seeing unscientific things in the Bible. For example, incest. So
yeah, but the incest we already addressed. It's not a scientific problem.
Right. I'm just clarifying, like, because you said I haven't gone into any of this. Like,
okay,
like
no
I haven't
worries.
heard any of this, and I'm just saying I have before. So
Richard.
Yeah. When it comes to that objection, that's what I got. That's all I have for that. I just have one more unscientific thing that I found in the Bible, but it might be unrelated to genomes. So I don't want to
before you do
else yet.
Yeah, before you do, Richard Dawkins made the point that he couldn't imagine what it would have been like to be an atheist before the time of Charles Darwin. Because where could they get their intellectual fulfillment? They were living in God's world and they knew it, and that's how all of the data was interpreted. But then when Charles Darwin came along, he gave a new perspective, a different way to interpret the data, which justifies this void that the atheists had, this intellectual void. But I find it interesting that when people like such as yourself are presented with the data, you're just stymied. I mean, we're not, as this critic in the chat says, just saying, well, we're just throwing the Bible at you. I'll be happy to defend that, but that's not what's been taking place tonight. You've been presented with the scientific data, and we've addressed your points, and there's really nothing left for you,
I
is
didn't
there?
say I didn't say you were throwing the Bible at me. When you
Well, no,
presented
the
the
critic in
charts.
chat, not you. Yeah, there's a critic in
Yeah.
chat who's kind of
Right. I'm not denying the
underwhelming with
data.
the
That's why
argument.
I haven't responded. I'm just looking at the
Yeah,
data now, and so I don't have
Well,
an immediate answer. So
that's fair. That's
and,
fine.
and another thing too, in great points, Sam, to the question of a literal Adam and Eve, secular Muslim, I showed you the data supporting a literal historical Eve who lived just thousands of years ago based on observed DNA variation. What about Y chromosomes? Every single human male Y chromosome on the planet, we'll get to you, Jackson, is nearly identical. 99.99% the same. And you can plot Y chromosomal DNA variation on a phylogenetic tree, and you have a last Y chromosomal ancestor that goes back just thousands of years ago, who we'd say is to Noah. And so we have a singular woman from whom we've all descended from using mitochondrial DNA, a single man that we've all descended from using Y chromosomal DNA variation. And if you want to bring in, according to the evolutionary model, our supposed closest living relative or closest cousin, the chimpanzee, when you compare, I should put a visual here just for you to see, to be fair. When you compare Y chromosomes, and I know Jackson will have something to say to this too, but let secular Muslim give his thoughts first. When you compare the Y chromosomes of our so-called closest cousin, the chimpanzee, notice, I mean, this is pathetic. This is the chimpanzee Y chromosome. Here's the human Y chromosome. Mind you, all human Y chromosomes are nearly identical, the same. Okay, very little variation. Bring in the chimpanzee, it's half the size. The gene content's totally different. The architecture is totally different. So when you consider overall gene content, architecture, and size differences, the human and chimpanzee Y chromosomes are only about 35% the same. So secular Muslim, using critical thinking skills, in case this is the first time you've heard this before, how do you address this? How do you account for such massive genomic changes or alterations in just 6 million years since the split, roughly? And here's a visual representation. This is the chimp Y, this is the human Y. To the biblical creationists, this makes sense. They're totally different because we're not related to the chimps, but you're arguing for a relationship. And so speak to this for a little bit. What are your thoughts on this? Do you find this to be curious?
yeah, very curious. I've heard a 97% number, 98% number, that we share 97 to 98% of our genetic material with chimpanzees, but what you're presenting here seems different than that. So
Well,
I would have to look at the sources and go back and compare them.
well, do you know the difference between Y chromosome DNA and autosomal DNA?
No.
Okay, this specifically is Y chromosomal DNA. So this is uniparentally inherited DNA. There's no recombination in Y chromosome. So it's relatively more stable. Okay. And so the Y chromosome should be more similar between humans and chimpanzees. Your autosomal DNA, that experiences, you get two copies, right? One copy from your dad, one copy from your mom, and you get recombination. Every generation, your your chromosomes reshuffle, basically creating new chromosomal varieties. But in this case, there's little to no recombination. There might be some gene conversion, but it's still relatively more stable. So if you want to include everything, that's what you're referring to. When you include everything, you're looking at somewhere between 96 and 97%. But even there, you're missing massive gaps, copy number variations, size differences. Centromeric DNA is oftentimes left out. And so there's debate there if it really is 96%, but it's no sweat off my back. 96% doesn't matter. The Y chromosome is the fatal blow. And so the Y chromosomes are drastically different, secular Muslim. And so this is something I would highly recommend you look into. Do you have any clues, anything at the top of your head, anything coming to mind as to how, from an evolutionary starting point, the Y chromosomes could be so different? Not to put you on the spot, but is there anything that's kind of popping out from your past research as to why this is the case?
No, not at the moment.
Okay.